Have you ever asked yourself questions such as, how much money does the church have? Why doesn't the church just give out all that money to the poor? Or why do we still need to pay tithing even though the church has that much money? You've heard those questions, or perhaps you are the one asking those questions. Well, today I'm going to try to answer some of those questions. Let's get right into it. The year is 1831, and the prophet obviously has established or restored the church, or the Lord has restored the church through the prophet. And now the Lord is speaking to the prophet on how to finance the affairs or the programs of the church. And so the prophet Joseph Smith uses revelation as well as contemporary business model, to sort of run financially the programs of the church. But now everything starts to change, obviously, with the great trek, so to say, begins. The saints now are required or asked or commanded to move to Ohio, then Missouri, and then Illinois. And then obviously later we know that they moved west to Utah. So obviously that increased the need for resources, and spending obviously increased, and there was a lot of now need for expenditure also too. So from the onset, the church now obviously started to meet its temporal obligations through donations and contributions from members of the church, because you can imagine the bill is now high. There's now more members to cater for, and obviously they have to now look after some of the members as well. And so the Lord now, obviously these people did it through cash, and then we learn also that some did it through property. So there will be people who would donate property to the prophet Joseph Smith, and also obviously for the cause. And if you go to Doctrine and Covenants, section 41 and 42, as well as 119 and 120, you read there that that's where now they are commanded to consecrate, and obviously their talents, their time, but also their properties. And so they begin to learn that. The prophet then teaches them about the law of consecration. And if you read further, you are then taught there that the Lord then instructed them, or also revealed to them, that they should establish offices as well as procedures on how to manage the oversight on tithing. And then they go ahead and then they establish some of councils. And one of the council that they establish is the council on the disposition of tithes. And we know that council is made up of the first presidency of, obviously, the quorum of the 12 apostles, as well as the presiding bishopric. And so if you speak to most of the members and you ask them, what do the presiding bishopric actually do? And you realize that some of us, we really have no idea what they do. But one of their main responsibilities is to sit on that council and to ensure that the resources of the church are utilized wisely, but also that the oversight management is in place, and that we are able to account honestly, with integrity, on how the church funds are used. And so they direct, obviously, like I said, not alone with the other quorums of the first presidency and the 12. So I mentioned tithes as the main donation, but there are other donations as well, like first offering. You've got your humanitarian aid, you've got your temple and general missionary work, as well as your ward missionary funds as well, that you can be able to donate to. And so the council then on the disposition of tithes then oversees the usage, and making sure that there are measures in place to ensure that funds are not misused. But then we know that the church then utilizes other financial tools, tools like loans. So the church in those days did take out loans, and also as well as bonds, and as well as stocks. And I think they did those three things for mainly three reasons. Obviously, to grow funds, and as well as to manage risks. And the other one is they need to achieve their goals as a church. And so sometimes they probably didn't have money on hand, and that's when the loans will come in handy. But as well as bonds, if they need to achieve another goal, maybe build a property somewhere, they will then sell something else. And then stock markets, obviously, that's where your investments come in, and you can utilize that money to do other things. And so I think, as I said, this is what the prophet had in mind, the revelation, and also just that business model that was there during the day, and they utilized that to help the church to make sure that it moves it moves. You know what I love about history is that it not only helps you understand where you're coming from, but also it helps you to understand why you are where you are currently. So in 1880, the US Congress, they sort of like, there was a law that was enacted, and that was the anti-polygamy war. And I'm sure you are aware about the history of the church with polygamy, which is something that I will not discuss any further, or even in the future. Probably maybe after 100 years I will do a video on polygamy. But anyway, there was an anti-polygamy law which was enacted by the US Congress in 1880, and I think this was sort of like a punishment to the church. So what they did is that they sort of confiscated, it was maybe a measure of trying to disincorporate the church. So obviously they confiscated the funds and also properties of the church. And interestingly, most people will ask you, why did the Salt Lake Temple take so long? Well, it's because they also confiscated the unfinished Salt Lake Temple. And like I said, it was more like a retaliation or a punishment, but it was a target against the church. Now obviously this is now between 1880 and 1890, sorry. But now the church is in a difficult position, because now they have all these expenditures to take care of, and they are really low on funds because their funds are now confiscated, or the government has taken it and used it for, I know they used some of the funds for education during those days. But what happens is that some of the leaders then go on a high cost, spree of getting loans. And high cost loans, and it's very difficult to pay back, because they come with high interest rates. But unfortunately they had no option. They were sort of like in a tight corner, and they needed to pay stuff, and so they went and got some loans. But unfortunately that set the church back so much that it was bankrupt, or in debt, so much debt, up until 1907. So we are talking about 1880, 1890, up until 1907. That mistake of getting into a high cost loan got the church into debt up until 1907. Can you imagine the trouble that the church was finding itself in? And so in 1950, what the church does after paying its loans is that it goes into, they call it an international project of buildings. So they because obviously the church has now expanded to other continents and other countries as well, so they go on a building spree. So they build schools, they build hospitals, and obviously church buildings as well. And unfortunately they used what they call now a deficit spending. So if you understand deficit spending, you understand that it's using money, or rather using more money than you currently have in your revenues. So that was really a tough decision, a tough time for the church, maybe a financial miscalculation. And so that's what. So they are in this situation, and now the prophet, who is David O. McKay, I assume he got some counsel from the brethren, or even revelation from the Lord, to say, we need to get out of this situation, we need some help. So what he does is that he, in October 1963, he calls one of the apostles, who's also a former businessman, N. Eldon Tanner. He calls him to the first presidency, and we know that he then took over the responsibility of looking after the finances of the church. But I like to believe that he did really come to the rescue of the church in terms of having those financial measurements in place to ensure that the church finds itself out of that deficit as well. And so he introduces 4 major things, and I think if every member of the church can follow these 4 principles, obviously they will live an abundant life. But this is what he introduced: strong financial controls. That's what he did. He also made sure that there were savings in surplus, not just for tomorrow, but surplus, so much that the church could then live off the reserves. And that's what he was doing, making sure that we spend on the reserves. And then the 4th thing that he did was to make sure that the church plans for the future. So he wasn't just looking to get the church out of debt at that particular time, but making sure that the church is set even for for the coming years as well. And so when we talk about living an abundant life, I look at the life of, or the service rather, of an elder Tanner, and how he managed to put those measures in place to ensure that the church has got tools to make sure that funds are taken care of, but also that we are not in the negative, and that we are not spending money that we do not have. Can you imagine uh, building temples with money that you don't have? Because I'm sure it was exciting for the brethren during that time, the idea of dotting the earth with temples. But unfortunately, they were building. I remember reading one talk that the brethren were even shocked, that there's a temple that is being planned, but when he goes into the coffers in Elden 10, he realizes, but how could he have agreed to build a temple here and there when there are no funds? So I think those measures that he did put in place were, and by the way, we learned that the reason why the church, even during the times of Gordon B. Hinckley as well as Thomas S. Monson, the church really did well financially, and I think because they were apostles during that time when Elder Tanner was called to sort of manage the finances of the church and set them into order. And so I think the methods that he used, these two apostles, who were later then called as prophets, took lessons from those measures, and they realized that this could be means of getting the church out of debt, but not just taking it out, but keeping it out of debt for forever, if not for a long run. And so I'm just grateful. But then we also know and learn that in 1999, the church, 1997 rather, the church then goes on this extensive, sort of getting into now extensively into the stock market, and I know that one of the criticisms that the brethren received was that they made bad financial decisions in terms of which stocks to buy or when to sell, and all of those, and there were people who felt that the brethren made bad decisions, and why did you have to buy these stocks? You bought things that we didn't need. I know that there was a point in time where the church had to sell some of the schools that they had. The church had to sell some of the hospitals and clinics that they had, and so I'm thinking that those criticisms will probably persist even today. There are people who do persist in those criticisms, but I'm of the view that even if you go onto social media, there are criticisms which are sort of characterized by sensationalism, and you have people, what they do is that they will find errors, and they will put those errors and then mix them with facts, and what that does, then it clouds us who are trying to get the truth, but it blocks us from discerning what is truth, because they use mistakes and then they mingle them, or mix them with facts. For example, someone will come and say the church has got this much or amount of money in savings, and there's a huge amount. I'll tell you now that there are people who are claiming that the church has got about 100 billion to 350 billion in savings alone, and people will just put that figure out there, but they will not necessarily go into details in terms of why are they savings, and what is the church doing, or how is the church using those savings. And one example would be also in terms of the stocks that the church buys. I know that one of the stocks that the church has is in Johnson & Johnson, but someone will tell you that, and then they will say to you that the church is pro vaccines, or they are pushing vaccines because they have shares in companies which produce vaccines, but they had those shares even before COVID. And so that's what I mean when I say that people will use error and then mix it with facts, but just to create an illusion, or this cloud for you and I, to make it difficult rather for us to then discern what is truth, because there is a lot of truth out there, but also there is some sensationalism, like I said, from critics of the church, and this sensationalism come in form of questions, and I'd like to interrogate just three of those. So yeah, one of the questions, maybe the first one I'll start with, is some people would say, why is the church focusing on finances and not just spiritual matters? and you sit there and you say to yourself, but the church has got more than 1,000 of chapels, church buildings. They've got about more than 200 of temples. There are storehouses, where people who are in need can just go in and grab whatever they need to sustain themselves for that period of time. You've got missionary work going on all around. We've got vehicles, you've got apartments, and you look at those things and you ask yourself, those things didn't just come because of prayer. you know Resources are needed to be able to fund those things. And so when people come with such questions and say, why are we not just focusing on spiritual things? I mean, we've got bills to pay, electricity to pay, we've got printing to do. If you go now on your phone, you can access the church app where you find all the manuals of the church, all the tools and resources on an app. I'm sure you know how expensive it is to make an app. You've got your family history search. That's an app that is made. Some continents have their own. I know in Africa we also have our own family search app. Those things are expensive. People don't realize how expensive it is to have an app and be able to maintain it. We've got a website. You know how expensive it is to have a website. But unfortunately, all of those things, we've got hospitals, we've got schools, BYU. Some of the people I know, I'm studying from BYU. So those are resources that are financed, or those are things that are financed. And unfortunately, you can't just say focus on spirituality, because we need funds to be able to run those spiritual programs as well. And another one is, why don't we release data and let the facts speak for themselves? I read something interestingly, and it says that facts don't speak, people do. And that is correct. I mean, if we put data out there, uh, even if you put a figure there, there will still need to be an interpretation of that figure, because maybe some people would obviously have a different understanding of what the figure is, but there will also be an explanation in terms of why this figure, why this amount, what is it used for. So I agree that facts don't speak, people do speak, just as critics. The figure is not a critic, people are critics, so they do speak. And the other one is, in terms of this releasing data. I mean, I'm sure there are confidentiality in terms of legal matters, in terms of you can't just release any data out there, especially if we are talking about the protection of privacy. So I'm sure that's what the church is looking into as well. So you can't just put out any figures out there, or maybe give us a line upon line items in terms of, oh, we spend this much on this person. Can you imagine if you are a member of the church, and you by the way, the church is not only just taking care of members, but there are members who are being looked after. When we talk about not just looking into the spiritual, there are financial matters as well that we need to look into. You speak to honest members, they will tell you that they fell into hard times and the church was there to rescue them. And that's what the money is used for. Now, can you imagine the church going publicly and saying, we've used this amount of money on this person, we've used such and such amount on that person? I mean, where's the confidentiality? How about protecting the data of the people? And I also mentioned that it is not just members. If you look at the church humanitarian aid, how much money the church spends, and not just on members, on non-members as well, all over the world. Close to 129 countries where the church is in there and helping out, whether it's drilling boreholes for water, whether it's immunization for people with malaria, or I know we've got hospitals here that are funded by the church. We've got eye clinics and ear clinics, which are funded, equipped by the church to ensure that anyone, whether member or no member, can go in there and receive a surgery. Wheelchairs are being donated. And so to go and then publicize these things would obviously be a breach of that legal confidentiality agreement. So I don't agree that the church should put out everything there in terms of who they use the money for, how much they used it for, And then the other one is like they say tithing is like taxes. So we should have a public accounting for how money is used, And I know that even before I had a non-profit organization, I did not understand how taxes work or how the tax law works, or even requirements. And I can tell you now, there are most people who don't understand how taxes work or how the tax law works or even requirements, And I can tell you now that tithing is not like taxes. And to say that it must be accounted for publicly, I mean, tithing goes to God, and it is to whom we must only account to, no one else. We must only account to God because that is His money. Once it leaves you, it is no longer your money. It is the Lord's money. So I don't agree that there should be a public accountability given in terms of how the church uses its money. And I think those measures that were put in place by an elder tenor are still there today, and that's how the church then holds everyone who's responsible for distributing or managing these funds is able to account. And another thing that these critics of the church like to do is they like to bring up this idea that there are some large amounts of money hidden somewhere which are secretly utilized by the church, and they kept on saying that even during the years where the church was using its savings to pay off debt, and I think one thing that we need to also understand is that the church is not a sort of money generating equity. That is not our purpose. We are not a money generating equity. We are rather a spending equity. That's what we are doing. We don't try to generate money, but we spend. And these critics, what they do, they try to, I think what the critics are trying to do, and by the way, the church is not afraid or scared of critics, but I think what the critics try to do when it comes to the finances of the church is that they try to scare us from looking for the church, because obviously if you hear of this church having so much money, you're going to start asking yourself questions, and that's what most people have done in the past. They've mistrusted the church to say, hold on, how sure are we that they are using the funds for the right things? And most people assume that just because they don't know what the money is used for, it means that they are being misused, that there is sort of like corruption somewhere, but unfortunately, we have to set the record straight that the church, by the way, it's a good wealth management entity. I think I've never seen an organization that manages its wealth better than the church does. I think firstly, uh, you would understand, and that's something that we need to get out there. As much as there are critics, we need to sort of like counter some of these critics with truth. And that is, one truth is that there is no one single person who's trying to, not even a single person who's trying to get rich off the church. No one. I've never seen or met anyone who gotten rich by just being a bishop or a stake president or a relief society president or a young women's president. No, none whatsoever. So no one is trying to get rich here. We are all volunteers, and that is something that we should be proud of. And the other thing is that they are invincible ubiquities, like, and when we talk about ubiquities, we are talking about things that seem to be everywhere. Like, you can go to any church on Sunday, you'll realize that there are sacrament cups there every Sunday, like religiously. So there will never be a time where the bishop will say we don't have cups for sacrament. They are there. So where does the money come from? From the church. That's what tithing money is used for. There's never been a time where any of us, and I'm sure even if there was, probably the bishop would be aware, but no member would probably know that there was load shedding, or there was no water during the week, or there were tissues ran out. It never happens at all. We always find tissues there. We always find the aircon working. We always find the mic on. We always find, as soon as there's a broken piano, we know someone is going to come from the facilities and replace it. There are always electricity units there. During the load shedding where I am, I know the church made a plan to make sure that we've got your converters and your solar panels, and so we can trace how the church is using the money. We can see it. We don't need the critics to tell us how the church is using its money. We see it every day when we go to these beautiful chapels. Some of the chapels have got beautiful gardens. The lawns are well taken care of. It takes money to do all of those things. So we can be rest assured that our money is not being misused, and that people are not, using that money for their own self-interest or self-benefit. No one is getting rich from the church. If you know anyone who's getting rich from volunteering a church, please let me know. But ever since I've been alive, I've never met a single person. Unfortunately, some of the people who are saving have been some of the poorest. But obviously the Lord blesses them and helps them to survive somehow. And we are volunteers. We do this willingly, without expecting anything from the Lord. But the point I'm trying to drive home is that the church manages its wealth very, very well, and that none of us can sit there and wonder, what is the church using the money for? We can see it. Buildings are there. Some of the most beautiful buildings. Temples are there. Every time there's a temple announcement, we know we are going to be blown away by the beauty of that temple. And you can go and Google some of the temples, the buildings that we have in and outside, just marvelous buildings. And when you sit there and you're honest with yourself, you can say, I'm glad that I'm contributing. And unfortunately, some of the critics are people who are not members of our church, meaning they don't even contribute. But they are more worried than us who do contribute. And so that is something that we should be wary and ask ourselves, why are these people who are not even contributing more worried about how the church uses its funds? And I'm listening to these people who are criticizing the church and saying the church has got reserve of 100 billion to 350 billion, as if the church is holding that money. I wish it could be more, and I'm sure most people on social media would agree that the church should save more. They should have more money. If they take it to trillions, let it be. You've got a single person who's got close to 100 billion, just one person. This is an organization that is taking care of its members, an organization that doesn't just close the door and say we are only going to look after our members. It takes care of the world. And so it's very interesting to see how the church utilizes its funds. You can see it. There's no need for critics to tell us how the church utilizes its money. But I want to state it again that I don't think the church is afraid of critics. I think when there are questions, the church tries to clarify and to answer. Where there are mistakes done by the church, they try to correct it. But what I have or taken issue with is when people try to weaponize their criticisms, and try to then draw or scare people away from the church. And that is what we should be wary of. No one should scare you and say, no, if you donate or pay tithing, your money is going to be misused. None of that happens. And it's something that we can at least be comfortable with, that members of the church, leaders of the church, do respect. So, as I continue to talk about these things that we don't really see in terms of how the church manages to manage its wealth so well. And I can imagine if the church was a government institution, how I'll be happy to know that my government is, saving money, trying to grow its money and making sure that we are not in debt, and I appreciate the church for that model that they use. But I just wanted to also make mention that, some of the things that people don't see is that during the COVID outbreak in 2020, there were over 80,000 missionaries worldwide, and all of them were put on a flight back to their home countries. All of them. There was no, we need to take out a loan. Oh, where is the money going to come from? No. But because the church had prepared for the future, they were able to do that. Last year alone, 2005, the church spent about R1.5 billion on humanitarian aid. These are some of the things that the critics, so obviously the church is aware of these critics and these attacks that are coming, particularly focusing on the finances of the church. And so they took out a paper. I don't remember which year it was, but in that paper they highlighted probably three of the things that make people want to attack the church or even question the church in terms of how it uses its finances. And one of them was that it's probably institutional distrust. Like people don't have faith anymore in organizations. They just think of the government and say the government is stealing my money, the government is using misusing my money or abusing my money. There's just corruption. And so I think the church is right to say that it's just institutional distrust. And the other one would probably be a personal passion, where people come and say, no, the church can't have so much money. Why don't they give it to us who are poor? And we could be wrong sometimes. We could be wrong because I've just shared with you that the church is helping members of the church. Unfortunately, the church lives by a principle that what it does, as the scripture says, that when you do your alarms, let not men, don't blow a trumpet and tell people what you are doing to people, or for people, but it's doing a lot. And one of the third reason will now be there's no specialized information. There's no specialized information. Like people will just throw in figures there and say the church has got these reserves. They won't tell you why the church has got reserves. What are they planning to do with those reserves? And unfortunately, even people we trust will come to us and tell us that no, there's no need for us to pay tithing because the church has got these reserves. I mean, tithing is not our law, and so who are we then to now stop uh, people from paying tithing, or even suggesting to people, putting those ideas in their heads that no, the church has got money enough, you don't need to pay tithing, and I don't want to talk about tithing, but I don't think it's in our place, to go and tell people that the church has got reserves, you shouldn't be paying tithing, or going to tell people and saying to them, the church has got so much money, they can help all the poor people here. They are doing that. They are helping poor people, not only church members, they are helping people all around the world. I just shared with you 1.5 billion rand just on humanitarian aid and welfare services. There are people who are being assisted with businesses. There I just spoke about going to BYU. If I can tell you how much money I'm paying BYU compared to what I would have paid if I went to a university here in my country, you won't believe it. The discounted amount that I'm getting there, that's the money that the church is using. And so there are ways we can be able to explain to people in terms of the concerns that they have, because people will have concerns, but we must be able to have the right information and not just be sensational like the rest and try to get members worked up and say no, the church has got so much money. So what we should be doing in fact is to be encouraging people to pay more tithing. We should be encouraging people to say donate to the church, so that it can continue to help members, so that it can. I'm telling you, anyone who says the church has not helped them is lying. They're lying. And ask honest people, they will tell you, they are not ashamed to say it. They will let you know that I was in this distress, or my husband lost his employment, or my wife lost his employment and the church came in. PEF, people are able to register for courses. Yeah, they must pay some back, but that's how life is. We don't just want to get everything for free without working for it, because it then means that we won't appreciate it. But the resources are there, the church is making it available. There are scholarships. If you read the history of the church, you'll realize even during the times of Brigham Young, he used to encourage sisters, like females, to go and study medicine, and the church will sponsor them. The church still does that even now. These are the funds that are in the church coffers that are being utilized to better the lives of members and non-members alike. And I think the problem comes in when we we want to be comfortable and say, no, the church should be giving me the money because the church is got all its money. Elon Musk, no one is going to Elon Musk saying to him, you've got close to $1 trillion in your stocks. Give us free Teslas. No, everyone is happy to buy Teslas. But unfortunately, when it comes to church, people will say, no, you've got so much money, just give it to us, the poor people. The church is giving money to us. If we are poor, the church has given money to us. If you go to the temple for the first time and you want to do your living ordinances, you don't have to pay. The church will pay for your transport. The church will pay for your accommodation. The church will even pay for your clothing, as well as the refreshments that you will need for those. And not just one person. They are doing that the whole of Africa. I know it's happening like that. These are donations. These are contributions from members. When you go to church and you see the lights on, it's not people who just sat and prayed. These are contributions. And so I'm thinking, instead of us trying to sit there and criticize what the church is doing with its money, we should be sitting there and saying, am I contributing? Am I helping the church to advance its objectives, its goals, its mission? We are planning for the future. We are planning for the second coming, and we don't want to go into the second coming with a debt or a deficit in our account. We don't know what will happen in the future. So we are planning. That's what the church is doing. Those savings are there for us to ensure that no matter what happens, no matter how the economy is interrupted, but that the operations of the church will continue. That no chapel will sit there in the dark and say, no, the church doesn't have money, they didn't pay electricity, or no, we don't have water because the church didn't pay water, or the missionaries say, no, we can't drive cars to areas because petrol was not bought or paid for. No missionaries should say, no, we don't have anywhere to sleep because the church coffers are dry. No, we are planning for those days where things will be tough. We are planning for the future. And that's what each and everyone should be taking lessons about and say, hold on, this is a great model that the church is using. Saving in surplus, putting in those strong financial controls, making sure that I don't just spend money on things that I don't need. I spend wisely, but I also save so that I can gain interest from my savings, so that I can utilize those reserves instead of just using my own money. And making sure that I plan for the future. But another reason the church is saving so much money is because of the story of the talent that the Savior speaks about in the Bible, where he gave one talent, the other 5, and the other one 10. And we learn that the other one went and buried. He says, no, this precious talent, one precious talent, I want to save it and protect it, so I'm going to hide it. And then we learn that the one with the 5 and the 10, they went and they multiplied those talents. And when the Lord came, he says, take from that one and add it to the one with the 10 talents. You can find the story in the Bible and read it better than I'm narrating it here. But the point I'm making is that's what we are trying to do. We're trying to be good stewards, whom when the Lord gives a steward to, we don't just sit with that stewardship, but we try and multiply it. Try saving for your own life as well. You'll see how better your life will be, how abundant your life will be. There's great lessons to learn from how the church is managing its resources and managing its finances. I don't agree that the church is hoarding its money. It's utilizing its money not just for members, but for every single person here on earth. So much money. And I just said, and by the way, the 1.5 billion that was used last year, it was a 4 to 9% rise from 2024. I don't know of any institution that, I'm not saying they aren't, but I'm not aware of any institution that spends that much money just on humanitarian aid and welfare assistance. I've said, and I've listened, and some people say we are forced to pay. No one is forced to pay tithing. No one is forced to pay tithing. I know of situations where people could not be buried because where they attend, someone said to them that, no, you are behind, with your donation payment, so we can't bury you. We don't do that in our church, because you are not forced. So that's why we are hoping that people will see that and willingly give to the church and not just sit there and try and count how much money the church has, what the church is spending it for. And I'm telling you, if we are self-reliant, you realize that we won't have time to sit there and try and argue about how much money the church has, how much money the church is saving, and trying to tell people that there's no need for tithing. We won't be able to have time for those things, So the church is not forcing anyone to such an extent that even if you are behind with your tithing or donations and death happens in the family, you will still be buried because the church loves you and you are our brother and our sister as well. And so it's just great to see how all of these controls and measures are in place. And I'm just sharing this so that it's important to understand where we come from as a church in terms of financial deficits and how much debt we're in, and then understand why an elder Turner had to come in and put those measures and those tools in place, and also understanding why now the church will be so cautious about just spending money and not having reserves, because we don't know what the future holds, and it's better for us to be prepared than to find ourselves in the same predicament that we did. Otherwise, if we do, it will mean that we have not learned anything from the past, and unfortunately the past is there to be learned from. So yeah, let me know what you think. Chap chap.